everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out. We know that you're really, really busy, so we wanted to especially thank you for coming out during this holiday season to our teach-in. So our interim CEO is under the weather, so she was really hoping to be able to greet everybody tonight, but she's under the weather, so she isn't able to make it, but sends her best. So let's see, very quickly, I'm wondering, have any of you ever been to a teach-in before? Have any of you ever heard of a teach-in before? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, just wondering, because when we titled this, we didn't know if people would know. So anyways, my name is Allison Nakamoto. I'm the Director of Education here at the Japanese American National Museum. And I just wanted to go over the program with you tonight. It's going to be really informal. We're going to start with 3 speakers. They're each going to be speaking for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to break into small groups and then discuss some the concerns that you have, your students have, and what kind of assistance and guidance you might be seeking. And at the end, we'll just share out and then see where we can go from there. So it's pretty informal. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the 3 speakers for this evening. The first is Mr. Mas Yamashita, who is a volunteer docent here at the Japanese American National Museum. The second speaker is Betty Hung, who is the Policy Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, LA. And then the third and final speaker is Mary Hendra, who is the Program Associate Program Director for the Los Angeles and Organizational Innovation of Facing History. She has a very long title. Sorry. So it will go first Mas, and then Betty, and then Mary, and then we'll break into groups. But I first wanted to say a few words of introduction about our first speaker, who is Mas. So Mas was 6 years old when World War II broke out, and like approximately 110 other people of Japanese descent, he and his family were removed to a concentration camp simply because they looked like the enemy. After the war, he moved with his family from the camp in Topaz, Utah to Salt Lake City, where he remembers he just wanted to fit in. And so tonight, he's going to share with you a little bit about what it was like to have the U.S. government remove you from your home in California, detain you and your family in a concentration camp for the duration of World War II, and then have to start over your life at the age of 10 in a new school in a new town. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Mas Yamashita.
Thank you. Like Allison said, we were living in Oakland at the time the war broke out. There were 8 in my family and 1 coming on the way. And so, like she said, I was 6 at the time. But I tell people that the camp was where my childhood began, because I don't remember much before that. So my earliest memories of childhood was started with in the camps. Now, when we were ordered to evacuate, I guess most of the camps weren't ready for occupation, so we were taken to a place called Tan Fran. Tan Fran, well, at the time, was a racetrack, horse racetrack. The people living down here in Southern California, they were taken out to Santa Anita, the track out there. So the first memories I had of the camp was sleeping in stalls, horse stalls. I remember them because we could hear babies crying and things, because obviously the stalls weren't insulated or anything like that. And we didn't have mattresses. We had to stuff bags with straw. I remember one day finally a truck pulled in with mattresses and we all went crazy. The mattresses were only about 2 inches thick, but it was better than sleeping on the straw. Anyway, so we were there for 6 months, from May to September. In September, they loaded us on trains. Well, I have to backtrack. The War Department had hired Dorothea Lange. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Dorothea Lange, great photojournalist, and Ansel Adams, and a couple of other photographers to record what was happening there. And But the caveat was they could not film any soldiers or barbed wire fences or anything like that. So it kind of made it look like we were going there voluntarily. So in September, they put us on trains, and I've always remembered this because I didn't understand why they did it, but they covered up the window with black paper. So I didn't know whether they didn't want people to look in or they didn't want us to look out, but they did it anyway. So they took us down. Next thing I knew, we were in Utah, Topaz, central Utah. Topaz was about 2 hours south of Salt Lake City. And so, like I said, this is where my childhood began. I remember that being my first Christmas. What they did was in the mess hall, they made a big cardboard fireplace and put it in front of one of the windows in the mess hall. And the Santa crawled through the window and came out and started. He was Japanese, of course, and he was passing out toys and things to us. And I still remember what I received was a little stuffed elephant, gray elephant. So the biggest issues us children faced was where to play, because we couldn't play in the rooms, they were too crowded. And so one of the places, if the weather was bad, and it was a lot of the time, it snowed a lot in the winter, we would play in the laundry room. There was a separate barrack that was set up as a laundry room, so we would crawl around up in the rafters and play tag and things like that. Or we would look for empty rooms in the barracks. And so, like I said, the biggest challenge was to find some place to play. And so it was that way for, like I said, for us children until the end of the war. So we stayed until the bitter end, and my father knew some people living in Salt Lake City, so we took our $25 and a bus ticket and just rolled up to Salt Lake. Now, for us, it was a very difficult time because we were very poor, and my father, who had been a gardener up in Oakland, decided he would try taking up gardening in Salt Lake City, but being that the winter months were very long and a lot of snow, there wasn't any need for any gardeners, so he took a job as a dishwasher in a Mexican restaurant. I remember the restaurant, a little one down in the dark alley. The only thing good that came out of that was he learned how to make great chili. But anyway, so those early days after we got out was difficult because, at least in camp, we all lived under the same conditions. But once we got out, we were all on our own. And so it was very difficult. Going to school the first 6 months or so was difficult for me because the teachers couldn't pronounce my name. To be honest, I didn't like being Japanese right after the war. I had my share of fights with kids calling me names. So it took me quite a while to adjust to that. For years, actually, I didn't talk about it. Even when we were in Salt Lake and I started hanging around with a lot of Japanese kids, I never brought it up. And looking back, I assumed it was because I was ashamed of it. Because for the longest time, you're ashamed of being Japanese because that's why they locked you up. So I didn't see any positives in admitting that we were in the camps. So I assume the people in Salt Lake know about it by now. They have a Topaz Museum right outside the city of Delta. Delta is a little town outside of where the campsite was. So anyway, coming to work here as a docent has been important for me because I feel comfortable about discussing what happened. I spent most of my career kind of, I wouldn't say turning my back, but just not participating in the Japanese community. So this is kind of my way of making up for lost time. Okay, any questions? No?
I have a question about education. Did you have formal school in the camp?
Yes, in the camps, yes, we had, I never know how to describe it, but American schools, and then we had Japanese schools afterwards. It was like if you were going to Hebrew school or something like that. We had to go either after school or on Saturdays. And speaking of that, when we got out of camp, my father wanted me to continue with Japanese school. This was in Salt Lake City, and so he asked me, are there any Japanese schools in the city? And I lied. There was at the Buddhist church, but I didn't want to continue with it, so I can't speak or write or read Japanese. Yes?
So did your siblings, you said that when you came out of the camp, right? You were what, 10, 11?
Yes.
So you felt like you just didn't like being Japanese. Did the rest of your siblings feel the same way as you did, or did they all have different experiences?
Well, here's the thing, and I think it was probably true with most of the people my age who went through the same experience. We didn't talk about it, to be honest, even with my siblings, and especially with our parents. You have to know something about the Japanese culture. That you didn't sit at the dinner table and discuss with your father what you did that day. You just didn't do that, you know. So I never knew what he felt about the experience. Now, he did, and might have been his way of making a statement. He carved, while we were in camp, he carved out, it was about this long, and out of one piece of wood. And on one end was a lock, a padlock, and on the other end was a key, and it was connected with all these wooden links. It was all carved out of one piece. So I assumed it was kind of his way of making a statement about that. So, to be honest, I don't know what happened to it. We lost it. I was going to bring it here and have the museum have it, but we can't find it. Okay? Yeah?
Moss, do you ever remember talking about government or democracy in school and camp, or how did they discuss that with the students?
No, I mean, like I said, that never. In fact, even after we got out, that was never brought up, as far as I can remember, in the classroom. In fact, I kind of looked for it in my textbooks all the way up through high school. I never saw one. I saw one paragraph about the camps, and it was in my sociology class. It was not in the history class, because they were history class. There was never a mention of it. So, and you had to really look for it. And back then, you know, we're talking about 50s. Anything else? Yes.
In camp, did you guys ever celebrate the 4th of July?
I think so, but I don't remember. I just remember Christmas. You know, we should have, in fact, upstairs in the gallery, we have, I guess it was bands that are just big, they have Boy Scout troops, and, you know, they always raise their flag during the Boy Scout ceremonies, things like that. But to be honest, I didn't experience it myself.
But you did celebrate 4th of July?
Yes? Oh, yeah.
Just a question, because I asked that of Tule Lake people too.
Pardon?
I asked that question of the Tule Lake people, and they said no.
Yes. I understand, but the people in Tule Lake were over there for a certain reason. You know. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Moss. All right, so now we're going to have Betty from Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA give us a kind of a broad landscape of the situation.
Thanks so much, Allison. So as Allison mentioned, I'm with Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA. We're the nation's largest civil rights legal organization serving Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. I just want to, and thank you, Moss, for sharing your story. And with such honesty. I just have a question, first of all, just to start off. How many of you are educators? Raise your hand. And what school districts do you work in? If you can just shout it out. LAUSD. Okay. Any other districts represented here? Okay. And how many of you, since the election, have seen or witnessed your students expressing greater anxiety or fear? You can raise your hand. And how many of you have seen or heard about any incidents on your school campuses? Okay. So what you're seeing and what you're witnessing is actually a national epidemic of hate. The Southern Poverty Law Center has counted, just in the 10 days after the election, nearly 900 incidents across the country of hateful intimidation, harassment, and discrimination against many vulnerable communities, including African Americans, immigrants, Muslims, LGBTQ people, women, girls, and very disturbingly, what the Southern Poverty Law Center also found is that K-12 schools are one of the most commonly reported locations of this kind of hate and bigotry. And so there has been an unveiling and an unleashing that we've seen nationally as well as here in California, where there have been incidents such as at San Diego, or San Jose State, a Muslim woman who was wearing a hijab was choked and had her hijab pulled off on a campus parking lot. Latino students in California, in Redding, California, were handed mock deportation letters by another student. And so it's in this kind of landscape of this outbreak of hate and bigotry that we as California have really, I have to applaud the leadership of our state legislature, we as California really have stood up to say that we stand for a different set of values, that we stand for diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I just want to give a brief sense of the landscape on the state level, the local level, and then to talk a little bit about some resources for educators. On the state level, our legislative leadership, Senate President Pro Tem Kevin De Leon and Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon, spoke out this past Monday, which was the first day that the state legislative session opened, and they introduced resolutions in both the Senate and the Assembly that really highlight the contributions of immigrants and that we as California are going to stand up for California values. Those two resolutions passed with bipartisan support. And they also introduced very important pieces of legislation. And I want to share this with you because these bills really represent our values in California. And to be honest, it's going to take everyone really coming together to support them and to ensure that they pass. Our Speaker Rendon even said that, in California we want to be a firewall, and that if they want to, meaning the Trump administration's policies, if they want to get through to Californians, they're going to have to come through us. So I want to just share with you 3 bills that I think are key and important for everyone here to know about. The first is SB 54, the California Values Act. This was introduced by Senate President Pro Tem Kevin De Leon, who represents this local area. And what the California Values Act does is essentially 3 things. It's trying to keep ICE, which is Federal Immigration Enforcement, out of California. There are 3 main provisions. 1, no state resources should be used to collaborate with ICE and in deportations. 2, it would institute stronger privacy protections in state databases. So if you think about, for educational institutions, some of the information that's contained in those databases around about your students or staff, there would be greater protections of the information in those databases. And 3rd, schools, hospitals, and courthouses would be safe zones from immigration enforcement. So these, in combination, are really intended to ensure that there are safe zones and that Californians, immigrant students, have protections. And I'll just quickly mention a couple of other bills. Another is SB 6, which is around due process, right? So President-elect Trump had announced in 60 Minutes that he intends to imminently deport 2 to 3 million immigrants. And we all know that there's no legal right when someone is in deportation proceedings to have a lawyer. And we know that a person's chances of being deported are vastly greater when they don't have legal representation. So this bill would actually provide for state resources so that the individuals in deportation proceedings would have access to a lawyer. And then the third piece, the third bill I want to highlight is AB 3, which would actually fund state regional centers to work with public defenders so that they have access to immigration law specialists. What often happens is people who are in criminal proceedings, they may plea out and not realize that there are immigration consequences. So, I know this is kind of policy wonky and technical, but it's really, really important that our state legislative leaders are not just espousing rhetoric about standing strong and standing up as a beacon of hope, inclusion, and justice, but they're really backing it up with concrete legislation. And it's really up to all of us, I think, to support them and to ensure that the grassroots are being heard and that this becomes law so that we have actual protections for students and all community members. Now, those bills really focus on immigrants, but I also want to share that I think there is an opportunity here where intersectional, diverse coalitions are growing. And by that I mean that the most vulnerable communities, MEMSA, which stands for Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Sikh and South Asian communities, LGBTQ communities, immigrant communities, communities of color, are really starting to form intersectional, diverse coalitions to stand with one another. How many of you were at the vigil here in Little Tokyo last night, where Muslims and Japanese Americans stood together? Wonderful. I mean, that is happening across the state, and I just want to share with you, I actually have some handouts on the table over there, but given the outbreak of hate and bigotry, we helped to facilitate a multiracial statewide College for All coalition that has over 50 organizations. UTLA is actually a steering committee member. CFT's California Federation of Teachers is a part of it too. And we drafted and coordinated an open letter calling on the state's educational leaders at the K through 12 level and higher education to ensure that all K through 12 public schools and all college campuses in California are sanctuaries. Sanctuaries for immigrant students, but also for students of color, Muslim, LGBTQ, female, and differently abled students. And I have to say, it was tremendous. We're just 3 days, over 120 organizations signed on to that letter. So I would encourage you to take that letter. It's an open letter. We sent it to Superintendent Tom Torlickson, State Board of Education President Mike Hurst, UC President Janet Napolitano, and the chancellors of the CSU and community colleges. And so the intention is for folks to be able to use it in your local organizing. LAUSD actually passed a resolution in February. The board recently affirmed it to try to ensure protections and safety for immigrant students. Culver City, the city of Pomona, Sacramento, local resolutions are popping up everywhere. So if you are interested in that, we have some materials so that you can go to your local school board or your local city and urge decision makers to pass resolutions that also have actual protections. The last thing I want to say is that we have really appreciated partnering with UTLA and CFT and other teachers unions. How many of you are members of teachers unions? Raise your hands. Okay. So I would encourage you to contact your union. UTLA recently also had an event for their members to talk about resources. The American Federation of Teachers has a set of materials. I also have handouts on the side. But it's you know, as Moss was describing, I think the role that educators play is tremendously important in creating safe spaces and really understanding what your students and their families are going through. And so one of the most important things that you can do is to be informed. There are lots of Know Your Rights materials. Again, I have some handouts, but be informed. Provide your students and their families with information as well. And I have to say that, you know, we are preparing for the worst, right? Every single day we are hearing about, individuals being nominated to cabinet positions and senior positions where, the senior White House advisor is a known racist, anti-Semite, misogynist, and white supremacist. So, and I say that because I think we want to be very honest and real and prepared, and recognize that it's also the time to keep going and to keep resisting and to work together and support one another. And the fact that there's been such an incredible outpouring by Californians and really reaching, building bridges and working together, I think that is what we need. You know, Van Jones calls it, that says that we need a love army to fight the hate. And we really do, and it's happening. And so every single one of us has a role to play, whether, if there's an incident at your school and you see bullying or hateful intimidation or harassment, to be proactive and to create safe space. One thing we also would recommend is that every school actually send a letter to parents and caregivers to make sure that, to set the tone that the school really prioritizes and places importance on diversity, inclusion, and equity, and that there are prompt responses if there are incidents of hate, and to use restorative justice methods, right? But this is also an opportunity to be proactive, where, as you'll see in our open letter, we think that this is the time where we need to actually invest in and support educators and students and families, right? With the resources, with the tools to really promote positive intergroup relations. And so another resource I would just point you to is the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance program. They have this incredible website as well. And so with that, I just want to close by saying that in California, I think we have an opportunity and an obligation to really set the tone and lead the way. And as California goes, the rest of the nation goes. And so we have the opportunity here to really stand up against hate, against bigotry, and to stand up for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so I would also invite you to join thousands of people on December 18th, where there's going to be a unity march here in downtown Los Angeles. Folks are going to meet at Pershing Square at noon, and this is a unity march that will be really representative of all of California. And so we'll march from Pershing Square to Grand Park and have a rally. And so, it's a way to really channel our energies, build community together, and I just look forward to seeing you there on December 18th. And please also consider our organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA, as an ongoing resource. We have a tough fight ahead of us. It's all hands on deck for the next 4 years. But if anyone can do it, we can do it here in California. Thank you.
Words of hope. And then finally, we wanted to have you hear from Hendra from Facing History, who also has some really great things to share with us.
Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. I want to thank both of the speakers who went before. I think it's so important to ground us in the history of individual stories and also in the context in which we're working today. And I want to thank the museum for putting this together because it's so important to have the spaces where we can talk. For those who aren't as familiar, Facing History and Ourselves is an educational organization. We're probably best known for a unique approach to studying history, where we really look at the stories of ordinary individuals and the context in which they lived and made decisions, the consequences of those decisions. And in doing this, we really empower students to think about the choices that they make, how they can choose to have their voice heard in the world, and what they want to leave as part of their contribution to our civic society. In order for students to explore some really difficult histories, like, as we heard, the treatment of Japanese American in this country, or the progression up to genocide and acts of injustice around the world, they need to have the skills to really engage with the material and engage in civic society. And so, particularly post-election, we have been focused on how do we help teachers have these skills, but how do we really help everybody? And so I put two handouts over there just to give a sense. One of them is the website that you see right here, kind of the rest of the page. We put together a collection of links that can help teachers, but really anybody, think about how do we talk in this world. And then on the other, the kind of matching page that has the similar banner, We Need to Talk, this was an ad that was put in the New York Times, which I love because it happened shortly before Thanksgiving, right, when we all gather with family, and we have those wonderful family conversations that can include the love and catching up, and can also include the, wow, you have some really different views than I do, right? From the family members that we may not spend a lot of time with the rest of the year. And I know that for me, like if I knew somebody had a very different opinion, I might not always go there in the interest of family harmony, right? But when we think about this notion of we need to talk, right, it's also we need to listen, right? So imagine if everyone in your family could hear the story of somebody who was interned in a camp. If everybody could hear this story of somebody who was unlawfully detained. If somebody could hear the story of the kids at the schools, as Betty mentioned, who came to school after the election more afraid, or came to school and experienced bullying in a different way, right? Or feared that somebody in their family would now be unjustly deported or separated from them in some way. And if we could listen to those stories, if we could share those stories with other people, how powerful that would be, right? And so it's not just that we need to talk, we do. We need to share these voices. We also need to listen. We need to listen for why are people afraid and why are people angry. And we need to think about and reflect on our own society. Right? What does it mean that the election turned out the way that it did? Right? And what does that mean for us going forward? It means we need to think about our past. What legacies do we still have in America today because of our history with race, our history after the Civil War and Reconstruction, our history in the world? What does that mean for us? So how do we listen? How do we reflect? And I would say, how do we stay engaged, even when we have people who have very different points of view? Facing History, I think, helps educators do this in some remarkable ways. Coming from somebody who was a teacher in a classroom and stumbled upon Facing History from a colleague, to somebody who's now on staff. We have the other piece I gave you here describes one of our most recent resources, which looks at the case of Ferguson. And it's called Facing Ferguson, with an attention to news literacy. Now, fake news gets a lot of press these days, right? And we're paying attention to it, but how do we discern news? How do we help students think about how do they engage with the news that comes to them? How do we think about it for ourselves and recognize where we may have a confirmation bias in what we are willing to believe and are not willing to believe? Okay. How do we ask the right questions of our news channels, right? And really think critically about the images as well as the words that we're getting and honestly that we're putting out there. Right? Because in this digital age, every one of us is a media producer as well as a media consumer. So what does that mean? What is our responsibility as media producers? What is our students' responsibility as media producers as well as media consumers? Okay. Facing History in Ourselves believes that there is a place for us to look critically at the history, both of the violence and the injustice, and also of these amazing moments where, for example, George Washington writes, "We're going to be a country that gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance." What did it mean to him when he said it? How have we lived up to and not lived up to that in our history, and what do we do with that? What does it mean that Chinese who were not allowed to be citizens effectively used the 14th Amendment to challenge unjust laws in the San Francisco Bay Area, right? And succeeded, right? Used the Constitution of the United States when it says that every person shall be protected. Right? Our students and we as adults can learn from these moments in history, both for the injustices and for the upstanders that made a difference. So, Facing History also is a resource for you as educators, but also I would say just as individuals. We encourage you to look at the tools, to give them space for thought, to bring them to people and think about what it means to bring these kind of conversations, to stay engaged with conversations at your dinner tables or your family gatherings during the holidays. And contact us with how we can help. I'm looking forward to the rest of this evening because I want to listen as well and hear what's coming up for you in your classrooms and in your circles with the people that you talk to, whether you are a formal educator or an informal educator of children who happen to be in your life, or adults that you are engaged with and talking. And I look forward to working with you as we go forward and to seeing how we can help.
All right, so now we're going to break into small groups. So maybe in groups of about 5-ish kind of people, if you can break into groups, and we're going to talk about 3 questions, which I'll put on the projector. And those questions are, what are the concerns of your students? What are your concerns as an educator? And what kinds of assistance and guidance are you seeking? So we'll have maybe about 20 minutes to talk about that, and we're going to pass out Post-its and pens and whatnot for you to record on, and then at the end, somebody from each group will report out, and then we'll wrap up after that. So if you could break into groups of about 5, we'll pass stuff out, put the questions on the board, and then we'll see in about 20 minutes.
Being really upset. So let me try and just figure out what's going on. So one of the conversations we were having is that there's policy, and then there's what human beings do, action, and then in general not good ones, that people are actually taking the hate and the thoughts that are in their head that have been passed down to them, and they're putting them into action. And policy is amazing, but there's a disconnect. So, and especially for our students, for example, my boyfriend's 15-year-old brother was like, "What's the point of voting?" I was like, oh, okay. I was like, "I have 3 years, I'll get you." So how do we build connections between human beings on the ground and policy that's kind of up here? We were talking about what is happening right now. People have been given permission for the hate. What else did we say? As teachers and parents and administrators, how can we assure and give hope to our students, even if we don't necessarily feel hopeful all the time, and that we have the same fears as our students, whether or not those are fears that directly affect us. We talked about the three of us as, white women. A lot of the fears that our students have are not things that might directly affect us, that people are not going to look at us and be like, I am going to commit a hate crime against you. But that we can provide space to talk about these issues and be not just allies, but comrades and activists and advocates. What else did we say? Let me pick one more thing here. Oh, I talked about the skirball. That's what all of this is. Yeah, that just we want to build a kind of tree of resources, kind of a foam tree, that if something is happening, we are able to start it, and then everyone is connected. And we were saying that this space here is the perfect space to start that.
Oh, yes, we have a question.
I have a question for you, or to the white female teachers.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Dream. Nice to meet you. And I'm just curious to know that, do you let your students know your fears, and do you tell them about your privileges and how you can be helpful to them, not only in class, but how you're being active and empathetic to them, but to the people you know that are surrounding you?
So I'm no longer in the classroom. One reason we sort of gathered is museum educators and retired teachers, but I was and am still, a lot of students have kept in touch with me and that sort of thing. I believed in open hearts, open doors, open minds, and that meant that you had to take some hits from your students and be open and vulnerable and share your own fears and your own concerns. I also taught 11th grade, and I think that you have to, one of our conversations we had is that 11th graders, I would have possibly a different conversation if I taught middle school or elementary school, right? You have to know who your audience is. But I always said that it was very, very important to let my students know that I had privilege. So I was poor, I was an emancipated teen, not by choice, essentially go, right? But I also knew that so I understand poverty and I understand fear and I understand that, but no one ever treated me horribly for any of those things, because on my front and my cover and all things, I have this privilege of being white. And I think that I have great empathy for students. And then I worked in the projects in Chicago in the 90s, and it had the last highest murder rate. I went to a funeral a week with, young children. So I have great empathy and fear, and I'm an activist. I'm still active in Human Rights Watch. So I think it's important for students to see my actions, but I don't expect other teachers to do what I did, but because I would hope that they would, but my expectation was I would never say to another teacher, you need to do the same thing, because I think then it has to be from your own core and your own decision, and I have to be honest with you, through the whole election, all my students that are seniors this year, that the emails, the text messages, I need to see you and talk to you. I was glad I was out of the classroom, because I felt like I was even more honest than I would have normally been. And I think being in the classroom this year, I think would have been a real challenge for me. But I appreciate your question. But I think it's hard. I think people don't always feel comfortable admitting their flaws.
Could I add to that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
If I answer? I teach 6th grade.
Okay.
Do we need that? Can you hear me? Microphone. I can't hear with like.
Me too. I like
I teach 6th grade, and yes, absolutely. Because I think it's important to constantly give them the opportunity and to engage with it more, so that they become comfortable naming that that's not okay, right? So that they can start experiencing more and more and more and more and more, oh, that privilege, that thing that got her there easier than it's gonna get me there, that's not okay, and how can I arm myself from that from the very beginning? And so yes, like, and they can totally handle it at 11. They should, and I think I owe it to them to name wherever it fits at any single opportunity, and it now fits all the time. Before I felt like I had to make the spaces for social justice education, and now it is just every single walk of life, and it has been for the past 2 years. An opportunity to name it for every time I can for them. So yes, say thank you for that question. I appreciate it very much. I'm gonna give it back to someone else because I don't like microphones.
One of these two groups like to I'll report out.
So we talked a lot about empathy and the disconnect that might have led to the circumstances of the election and a lot of all the feelings going on between everyone, students, teachers, just and beyond. And some of the things we talked about was how sharing personal stories can help ease that disconnect and help create those opportunities for people of different groups to be allies to each other, be supportive of each other. We also talked about racism and how it wasn't just an individual thing, but it can be very systematic as well. And that's something that a lot of people, that can help create that disconnect, because as you were mentioning, I can't word it as well as you did, but when you were mentioning, some people might think, for an example, President Trump or some of the people in his upcoming cabinet have very racist ideas, and that makes them racist. But they're not. People might not be thinking about the systematic ways that those ideas, so beyond being a racist, how that affects people in general in their individual lives through that systematic racism. So that's something we have to remember, and that's why we try to get rid of this disconnect and create a connection. And that involves, challenging prior beliefs. So it's one thing to talk about diversity, it's another thing to actually experience it. And experiencing diversity challenges our beliefs, because if you're used to interacting with a certain environment, certain people, and you're put into a whole new situation, you might be uncomfortable, but it's that discomfort that helps create those connections, again, that we're trying to create. And of course, inclusivity, I can never say that word. Channeling empathy, looking at multiple perspectives and experiences. These are all the things that we were talking about, essentially, and how we need to avoid that discomfort and that fear, because that's what leads to hate in the first place. So that's what we discussed. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to say on that in my group. If anyone has any questions? Thank you.
I'll do it. I can do it. It's okay.
We talked about much more. We talked about so many things. This was in response to the question.
Yes.
Feel free to go.
We had a wonderfully diverse group as well of people that work here and people that work in higher education institutions and people who are creating education for educators. So we had kind of a mixed bag of conversations, which was wonderful. We talked a lot about fear, fear of how our families are doing of our students, fear of how everything is affecting them, and also fear that perhaps we'll do this wrong, fear that we're not giving them all that they need. We talked a little bit about a direct fear with everything to do with DACA and just, you know, especially in this space, talking about registries of people's information and how that's really scary. I know that you guys have done an amazing job organizing that resource, which I've already printed for my parents. If you don't have it, it's over there. Talked a little bit about what the district has already done in terms of sending out a letter of solidarity, and I know me as a teacher, it was kind of like a punch in the face and a reminder that I need to do that as well, and reach out to my parents and let them know that I'm here, and to push my principal, who was a little bit more resistant to do that, to do something for our parents. I'm not sure what's in the back. Oh, we talked a little bit about this moment in time, especially in the museum. I guess a question that comes up very often is, you know, kids come here and they think, oh, this is a horrible thing that happened in our history, and we tell them it totally is, and it won't happen again. So don't worry, right? And how do we answer that question a different way? Because we have to. I think that is a big thing to work on as educators. We all felt that the answer to that question has to change. And how do we do that without outright scaring kids, but also giving them the reality of our history and the possibilities that lie in it. Did I say everything? Did we miss anything? Okay. Thank you. Next time you can do it. How about that?
All right, we definitely want to, you know, respect your time and end on time, but I can't tell you how powerful this was for me to hear all of you speaking and sharing these stories and being really like authentic and true. So I really appreciate